I am standing here to introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Sherrilyn Ifill. Sherrilyn Ifill is the president and director-counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And if that title doesn't sound familiar to you, it's the title that was held by Thurgood Marshall. He was the first president and director-counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And so Sherrilyn Ifill is today's Thurgood Marshall. Now, you may think that those are big shoes to fill, but I think that I can say fairly confidently that Thurgood Marshall would be so proud of the work that Sherrilyn Ifill is doing that he would be happy to know that the shoes fit quite comfortably. Just in the last year, and I'm not going to go into a lengthy biography. As you know, the biographies are in your booklet. But just in the last year, Sherrilyn has led the way on many of the issues that this conference is devoted to. She sued HUD and Ben Carson over its refusal to implement one of the more important rules to desegregate housing in this country, and that was a rule that adjusted the rent subsidies that HUD gave in what we call Section 8 vouchers so that they were adequate in many metropolitan areas to rent homes not only in deeply segregated low-income communities but in middle-class incomes communities as well. And she won that suit, and now HUD is being forced to implement that rule. Thank you, Sherrilyn. She led an LDF lawsuit to prohibit the school district of Glendale, Alabama, from seceding, from creating a separate school district for white students only. And the Court of Appeals sustained her complaint, and the school district has been prohibited from splitting off a whites-only school. And as I was writing my book, The Color of Law, she kept on telling me, Richard, it's transportation, transportation, transportation. And then she filed a complaint with the Department of Transportation, the U.S. Department of Transportation, over the fact that in Maryland, the governor had transferred funds that were designed to create light rail that would enable African Americans from the west side of Baltimore to have access to jobs in suburbs and transfer those funds to highways to enable suburban commuters to more easily get into the central city. That complaint is still pending, but I hope that not too long from now, we'll be able to congratulate Sherrilyn again for another complaint. Let me just say this. Many of you have come up to me and praised a book I wrote last year called The Color of Law, but few of you understand the enormous influence that Sherrilyn Ifill had over the conception of that book. Just last month, I was preparing the paperback edition and writing a discussion guide for reading groups. And as always, before I sent it into the publisher, I sent it to Sherrilyn for her advice, and she was, as usual, running from one Court of Appeals to another, I assume, and so she had 5 minutes to glance at it. And she took her 5 minutes and sent me a devastating critique, which forced me to rewrite the entire thing, and it's now quite something I could be proud of. So thank you, Sherrilyn. Now, there is one change before Sherrilyn comes up here in the program that I want to announce. Following Sherrilyn's keynote, as you know in the program, there's going to be a panel, kind of the wrap-up panel, the cleanup hitter for the 3-day conference on remedies, large and small. And that panel was going to be chaired, moderated by Christopher Edley, the former dean of the law school here at Berkeley, someone who, again, in the program you can read a very distinguished career. I was notified a couple of hours ago that he's taken ill and unable to be here. This was quite a problem, having the wrap-up panel of the conference without a moderator who has been working with the panelists in how to organize this thing. But then we looked around and we saw that Sherrilyn Ifill was in the room, and she's used to fielding unpredicted and unpredictable questions from Supreme Court justices. She's quick on her feet and so adept that I snuck over to her table and said, "Sherrilyn, you're moderating this panel." And without a blink, she said, "Okay." So I want to welcome to the podium my heroine, Sherrilyn Ifill.
Thank you all very much. I do want to point out that Richard did not ask me if I would moderate the panel. He simply said, "You are moderating the panel," and I assented. So I just want to first of all thank Richard and John Powell and the other organizers of this conference for including me in it. This is a really important gathering and convening, and I have really been enjoying hearing the presentations and hearing the questions, hearing the rigor that you all are bringing to this very important conversation, and hearing the energy and the enthusiasm in the room to work for change. This is not easy work to do day in and day out, and so I actually do enjoy being among my colleagues, my fellow people who've devoted their lives to believing in equity and justice and truth and peace and integrity and ethics and our children. It encourages me tremendously to spend time with you, and this conference has been exceptional. John and I have known each other for more than 25 years or so, and he's always on the cutting edge of thinking about complicated issues of race and racism that so bedevil us in this country, and we shouldn't diminish the importance of just that project, the project of thinking about what is happening around racism. It's a very complicated thing. You know, I remember a few years ago, a case in the Supreme Court involving a patent issue around the human genome. There was a part of the decision in which the late Justice Scalia concurred with the majority opinion. He wrote a separate concurring majority opinion, and he concurred with the opinion. And then there was a section of the opinion that he said he couldn't concur with because he didn't know enough about macrobiology. And I remember being struck by this part of the decision because I often wondered why Justice Scalia felt so expert in talking about race when he didn't know very much about that either. And I think it's because people think like everybody has a race, and so everybody knows about race, but it's actually an incredibly complex discipline. To do this work, certainly do this work as a litigator, requires that you understand history and that you understand sociology, that you understand economics, that you understand political science, that you understand demography. It's incredibly complicated, and it's kind of what I love about it because it is incredibly intellectually stimulating, but it's also intellectually challenging. And so you have to be constantly reading. If you're doing this work and you're not reading some book right now that's helping you think about how you understand equality and equity and race, you're not doing it right. This is a lifelong process and a lifelong discipline of study. And so the work of John Powell and the Haas Center is really important in recognizing how important it is for us to understand, okay, what's going on now? How did we get here? How is this being framed? How do we need to reimagine it? What are the strands we need to pull together to help create new paradigms for confronting the opposition to those of us who believe in justice? And so I want to thank John and the Haas Center for that work. I wanted to be part of this discussion in large measure because Richard and I really have been talking about issues of housing segregation. I think where's Richard? Where'd he go? There he is. I think for 3 years now, since we first appeared on a panel together at the Economic Justice Institute with Professor Patrick Sharkey and Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think was the panel. And we had never met before, but it was kismet because Richard was talking about the things that I care about and some of the research that later became The Color of Law, his book. And I was talking about some of what I know about the communities that I've worked in, and a little about my own little obsession with these issues as well. And so I don't remember who stalked who, either I stalked him or he stalked me, but we began doing almost a kind of dog and pony show together. And actually someone outside was just reminding me of when Richard and I did our talk about the history of federal policy in creating segregated housing in this country. We did it at HUD, where you'd think like people would be like, yeah, nodding, but they had never heard any of this before. And so it was like amazing that we were bringing to HUD, you remember that, this information that you would hope that the folks who are charged in the federal agency with dealing with housing segregation would know this history, but they did not. And I knew then that we were on to something. And so I think of us as partners and collaborators in the effort to revive this history of the federal government's role in creating and enshrining racial segregation, particularly in the American North. But my meeting was in some ways fortuitous because it came as I was also coming off of a few years after my book was published, which was a book called On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century. And that project was the culmination of 5 years of research that I did and was published in 2007 about the last 2 recorded lynchings in Maryland, where I live when I'm not at LDF in New York. And my interest in those 2 lynchings, and in fact I learned about those 2 lynchings while I was litigating with my students while I was a professor at University of Maryland Law School, and I was litigating a transportation civil rights case. We were challenging the siting of a highway next to a historic African American community on the eastern shore of Maryland. And our research revealed that this was the 3rd time in 60 years that the state had run a highway either directly through or next to this particular African American community. And I learned about the lynchings because, like a good civil rights lawyer, I was a young lawyer many years ago at LDF. And one of the things you learn when you're doing civil rights litigation is that almost the first thing you want to know is something about the history of discrimination in the jurisdiction where you're working. And so that's part of kind of just what we do. And so when I went to Maryland to teach and I was doing these cases on the Eastern Shore, the first thing I wanted to know is tell me about the history of discrimination in this community. And I learned people would talk about these lynchings that happened in the 1930s. And I won't belabor you with it, but I came to believe that these 2 lynchings were grotesque and horrifying physical acts that were powerfully situated in the history of this community. That what I was seeing then in 1997 was inextricably tied to these events that happened in 1931 and 1933. That the relationship between blacks and whites had almost frozen in place after those events happened. And that they were very much relevant to the work I was doing. And that in fact, these physical acts, remember I told you the name of the book was On the Courthouse Lawn, were kind of hiding in plain sight. The 2 lynchings I wrote about had occurred not in the woods or someplace secret. I had been taught as a New Yorker to believe when I was growing up that lynchings were things that occurred in the woods, but that they occurred on the courthouse lawn. I mean, I remember in one county, it was at the corner of Main and Division. It's like Americana. And so I named the book On the Courthouse Lawn to expose this idea that right in the public space is this history that is hiding in plain sight, but that very much is powerful and important and resonating in a very contemporary way in the kind of world of race that we see in front of us. One of the lynchings took place in front of a crowd of 500. These are very small towns, and the other in front of nearly 2,000 people. So the horror of these events could not be seen, in the kind of bucolic and quaint setting of the county courthouse lawn, but they powerfully shaped the landscape of those communities. And once you knew what had happened, as I did, and where, then every street and building, the location of the black part of town and the white part of town made sense. And the motivation for the white community's decision even to run that first highway through the black community not too many years after the last lynching seemed clear as well. Having read through accounts of hundreds of lynchings in places all over this country as I did the research for this book was kind of like taking the red pill in the movie The Matrix. Anybody remember the original one, the first Matrix? Remember, if you took this red pill, you could now see that we were living in a matrix, right? That everything we see was all just kind of made up, and that instead we were living in this kind of dystopian world in which computers had taken over. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. And I even remember a scene in the movie where one of the people who was part of the team fighting the machines, was eating a steak. And it wasn't a real steak, of course, because those things didn't exist anymore. But he said, I know it's not real, but it just tastes so good. And I thought that was like a perfect analogy for America and race, the way in which we delude ourselves, the way in which we, either we don't know, either we haven't taken the red pill, but even if we have taken the red pill, it becomes too much for us, it becomes too overwhelming. And we often retreat back to the fantasy, make-believe world, rather than face and confront the truth about race in this country. So for me, I've taken the red pill and I can't untake it, and I don't want to untake it. The result is that when I travel around this country, I see the physical landscape through the lens of these long forgotten events that shape what we see today. I mean, this may sound morbid, and maybe more like the boy from the movie The Sixth Sense who sees ghosts everywhere, but it's not like that for me. It certainly annoys my children, because we'd love to go on driving trips, and we'll drive into these small towns, and everyone will be talking about how pretty it is, and I'll be saying, isn't that the place where those 4 lynchers, came from in 1945? And my kids just hate it. But, I find it fascinating. And so I enjoy having this third eye because I want to understand how racism manifests itself in the physical space. To dismantle the effects of racism requires, in my view, understanding its architecture, the building blocks that created the conditions that we see today. And Richard's book, The Color of Law, is another red pill. His clear and unvarnished explication of the racist federal policies that created our racially segregated physical landscape in the North is essential to helping us really see the architecture of racism in our physical space. What I mean to say is that racism, one of the country's original sins, and here I mean specifically anti-Black racism, is real. It's so persistent, it's so part of the fabric of this country that we may be ignoring the fact that it has a physical shape and form that sustains it. And that feelings of bias and hostility, coupled with federal, state, and local government policies, produced racism that exists as a physical entity in our world. We used to know this, as Richard likes to say. We used to know this history of housing policies at the federal government level that created segregation. And we used to know it simply because of the way segregation manifested itself in the physical landscape. Thurgood Marshall, in his oral argument to the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, described for the court, white kids and Black kids in Baltimore playing together and then walking their separate ways to go to segregated schools. We had signs on water fountains and in waiting rooms at bus stations that told us that racism had a physical dimension. Being compelled to sit in the back of the bus as a Black person, even the social code that once existed of stepping off the street to allow a white person to pass, made clear the raw physical reality of racism and its evils. We used to understand that Black communities being located on the other side of the tracks was not just a geographic marker, but was a physical manifestation of racism itself. But one of the consequences of the end of the most egregious forms of racism in signage and some of its more explicit de jure forms, and as we get further and further from the history that baked racism into our physical landscape, whether it's violent acts of terrorism, like lynching, or the FHA decisions that demanded segregation and the insurance of home loans, which Richard writes about, or the tax support provided to assist racially exclusionary developments like Levittown, also discussed in Richard's book, or the Black communities that once existed in places where they no longer exist, like the Black community that existed on the place where the St. Louis Arch now welcomes visitors to the gateway to the Midwest, or that a particular community was a sundown town. I also encourage you to read James Lowen's book, Sundown Towns, to learn about all the towns across the North that would not allow Blacks to stay in the town after sundown. Those things were real and tangible, and it may be that our distance from them has made us lose sight of this history, and we may even have convinced ourselves that it's a thing of the past. I fear that we've come to accept the physical landscape as inevitable, as simply our city, our town, our suburb, instead of recognizing that the removal of racism and segregation's manifestations in our physical landscape was among the massive projects called for by the civil rights efforts of the 1950s and 60s. It's the project that should have been undertaken with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It's the project called for in many ways in the recommendations of the Kerner Commission report. And I think we know from our discussions over the past few days, that we have failed in this project. And thus the policies and decisions that we make or allow today, any decision that affects housing, zoning, development, infrastructure, unless they are expressly and explicitly and deliberately focused in some measure on ameliorating, responding to, or providing reparation or for pre-existing discrimination in the physical landscape, those policies and decisions are either perpetuating pre-existing manifestations of discrimination or contributing to new dimensions of a discriminatory landscape. This is important because I fear that we miss opportunities to do the kind of relentless upending and interruption of segregation and racism in our physical landscape that is required if we are to get to a place not only of integration, but of equity, reparation, and fairness. It astonished me, for example, to watch as cities all over the country, including Baltimore, rushed to participate in the Amazon HQ2 contest, all vying to be selected by this powerful company as the site of a new headquarters. Cities understandably attracted by the prospect of jobs and investment. But what invested me more is that there was not the slightest public discussion about the fact that among the criteria listed by Amazon was not a requirement that the city selected be one that is racially integrated or that is prepared to invest infrastructure dollars or prepared to promote policies to foster racial and socioeconomic integration. What a powerful message that would have sent, an incentive that would have been to have Amazon state explicitly that it valued racial integration as a marker of the kind of city or community in which it seeks to locate its future headquarters. And this is not just about Amazon, this is about all major development in our cities like Port Covington in Baltimore, or any of the developments promoted by tech here in California, or any baseball or football or soccer stadium development plan. If cities, major urban centers or suburban cities, had ordinances that required every development project over a certain amount of money to include a detailed plan for how that development will foster or promote racial and socioeconomic integration, then developers would have to regularize this as part of their thinking and planning. Not a bar to development, no particular requirement of the kind of integration plan required, but to just put the onus, the responsibility, the requirement on every development plan that it includes some aspect that focuses on racial and socioeconomic integration. This goes to the point that Betsy Julian was making yesterday, that the work that we must do is multi-pronged. It requires, of course, enforcement by the federal government, which we know is not happening in the next 3 years, and so people like me and Phil Tegler, who's here today, and other civil rights organizations did sue and successfully sue Ben Carson and on the fair market value housing voucher effort, and stay tuned for potential litigation on their attempt to delay the AFFH rule. And so we'll do that. We know that this administration is not likely to do the enforcement role. But there are also other things that we can and should be doing. And some of this is local action. My sister, Olivia Lynch, is here. I didn't know she was going to be at this conference. I walked in yesterday and there she was. She's sitting right there in the center. Wave your hand, Olivia. That's my big sister. And she's amazing. And really brilliant educator here in California. And I'll talk about her a little bit more in a minute. But she asked yesterday, what plans can we get behind? You know, she said, we can't wait. And so I do want to suggest that you can get behind the promulgation of local ordinances of the kind I just described that tie development to integration and equity. You can do this today. No tax breaks or support should be going to major development projects in your community unless those developers have, as a part of their plan, identified how they will address and confront and play a part in promoting, dismantling racial and socioeconomic segregation in your town, city, or county. Nobody needs to wait to do that. Understanding that nearly every decision that affects development or infrastructure has an implication for segregation, and it's key to recognize that. So Richard said I hounded him about transportation, and it's true. The folks in Baltimore know this, that the Red Line, the subway that was planned to go east-west through Baltimore City, was something that had been worked on for 15 years. And it was important because, of course, we all know that one of the key issues that we don't talk about enough in the context of segregation is mobility. It's not just about segregated housing, it's about your ability to move throughout your community. It's about your ability to get to the jobs that may be in the suburbs, your teenagers to get to the mall where the jobs are for them in the summer. And what we don't recognize once we get out of the big cities in this country is that second-tier cities in this country, most of them do not have effective rapid transit systems for working class people. And that contributes to entrenched segregation, in which people who live on one side of town never even go to the other side of town. And so it was deeply painful during the unrest and the final days of the unrest following the death of Freddie Gray that the new governor of Maryland, 6 months in office, new Republican governor, canceled the Red Line, canceled the plans for this subway that the Department of Transportation was holding the money for, that the Small Business Administration and the Department of Labor was planning and working with communities on creating small business opportunities for African American entrepreneurs to own the newspaper stands and kiosks at the different subway stops that were planned, that 10,000 construction jobs were planned to roll out the beginning of the construction of the highway, that the construction trade apprenticeship plan that was planned for Edmondson High School on the west side, what that would have done for young students. And with the stroke of a pen, one man removed that. Now, all of you know who Freddie Gray is, but I'm betting most of you didn't know about the Red Line. And when the governor was asked about why he was not willing to continue our investments to support the Red Line, he said, "We just spent a whole bunch of money on Baltimore for the riots." So some of our thinking about segregation and equity has to open up and understand that almost every decision that touches the physical space of your community is a decision that either is perpetuating or working against entrenched segregation. And once you have that in your head, then you're paying attention to every single one of those decisions and the dollars that go behind them. Water is an issue that we're looking at very closely at LDF because, of course, we know about Flint and the issue of the lack of potable water. Before Flint, you probably remember that Detroit was involved in massive turnoffs, water turnoffs, because of people who owed water bills and because of water tax liens. And when Detroit was in the midst of its bankruptcy negotiations 4 years ago, they would plan tens of thousands of water turnoffs to homeowners during the summer of 2013. And we did some work around that issue, even got the special rapporteur from the UN on water to come in and declare it a human rights crisis, which it was. This was one of those instances in which we felt it was important to take LDF's brand and take an issue that had been framed as a consumer issue, as people not paying their debts, to cover it with our brand and make clear that it was a civil rights issue and that it needed to be seen that way. So we know about Detroit, we know about Flint, but do we also know that water tax liens is becoming one of the leading means by which African Americans are losing their homes? That unpaid water bills result in water tax liens that end up putting houses up for auction. Last year in Baltimore, 1,500 homes were slated to be sold at foreclosure because of water tax liens. The mayor has imposed a 1-year moratorium, and we'll have to see what that looks like in the future. The city of Flint, which didn't even have potable water, was planning to foreclose on 7,000 homes last year. And we worked with individuals and activists and groups in the ACLU and others to get a moratorium over the water turnoffs there. A Michigan state study is estimating that 41 million American families may not have access to affordable water by 2022. Do you know how soon 2022 is? And this is in large part because of the decisions that we have made to not invest in the infrastructure that carries our water. And so it has resulted in the increased water rates that have grown exponentially over the past 15 years and that people simply can't afford. So we're talking about millions of Americans who will be unable to afford water and also who stand the risk of losing their homes because of water tax liens. Do you see what I mean about all of these different pieces that we have to pull into this conversation about housing? Someone asked Betsy Julian yesterday, should we talk about it differently? And she said, I don't talk about housing discrimination. We have to talk about it in much broader terms rather than limiting it to just housing itself. But there are still other ways to confront racism in our physical landscape. I mean, I think even the demand, especially most recently by young people, for the removal of statues and monuments that glorify the Confederacy is part of that project, and that's why I'm so thrilled with it. And I salute Mayor Landrieu, who was here this morning, for his courage in removing the statues in New Orleans, but moreover for his extraordinary and powerful speech, which if you haven't read it, you should Google it, about why those monuments needed to be removed. In my book on lynching, I suggested that public spaces where lynchings occurred should be marked, that people should know what happened in these places. And Brian Stevenson, the brilliant and visionary executive director at the Equal Justice Institute, has taken up that call and is set to open an extraordinary museum in Alabama later this year that includes a public marker project. All of these are efforts to uncover the secrets that exist in our physical space about how the world that we live in was constructed out of racism. So I want to turn just for a moment to talk a little bit more specifically to my thinking about the Kerner report and some of the discussions I was privileged to hear yesterday. I have to say, to read the Kerner Commission report, if you're a civil rights lawyer, is somewhat frustrating and deeply convicting. I mean, to read it, to absorb the sense of deja vu, of Groundhog Day, challenges us. And this really leads me to the point I want to end on, which I think is what I hope we can begin to take away from these discussions. Because this battle that we're in is not only one about policy and one about law. It's not only going to be won by litigation. It's not only going to be won by enforcement. But there also is a narrative battle that we have to engage in to undergird this work. And so I must disclose a little bit that's personal for me about what it means to be, 50 years from 1968, 50 years after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and of Robert Kennedy. It's a year burned into my memory. Of course, I was very, very young in 1968. I really was a little kid. But I had a sense early that year of the unease and despair that was caused by those very public events. But it was also a year that was dominated for me by the death of my mother, of mine, Olivia's mother, who left behind 10 children, of which I'm the youngest. And I mentioned that my sister's here, Olivia, and brilliant educator, and I still call her the smartest person I know. And when I was 4, the year before my mother died, I think is when she first went to NYU as a young college student. And I have vague memories of actually seeing your dorm room. Many people know I'm a graduate of NYU Law School. I always wanted to go to NYU because my big sister went to NYU, and it seemed like the coolest thing ever. And I do call her the smartest person I know. And her commitment to young people, her commitment to education, her commitment to real education, the education that helps you realize the self, is extraordinary. But my other siblings are also extraordinary, nurses and a doctor, and they've all made it, So 50 years since 1968 has me this year reflecting on how we could have made it given what we faced, and it's led me to think about the way in which the time we're facing now is even more challenging than 1968, because what allowed me and my sisters and brothers to make it was a sense in this country at the time, despite all our problems, that there was a value in public life and supporting public goods. And when I think about it, my entire early life was supported by public goods and policy decisions designed to promote the public good. I was one of the first of that generation in our neighborhood to go to Head Start, and I can remember the excitement of the parents about this new thing called Head Start. I was bused to an integrated school in Queens, in Flushing, and I went to integrated schools K through 12 in New York City, and had an excellent education for that brief period when it was working for many of us. Saturdays for me were spent at the public library at the Baisley Park branch. It was the only place that my father would allow me to go on my own. So I could walk to the library, and I would take out 10 books every Saturday and come back the next Saturday and take out another 10 books. I had siblings who attended City College at the time that the registration fee for City College was $85 a semester, and I can remember the struggles, the serious struggles to find the $85. But it could be found, late though it may be, and with borrowed books, my sister and my brother could go to City College. Public transportation was a huge part of our life. I can remember the job I had in high school in Harlem, even though I lived in Queens, and I was able to get to that job with my 35-cent token, taking 3 trains. And we didn't go on vacations, but we were in state parks every holiday with our picnic baskets. And I'm sure we were, now that I think about how many of us they were, I'm sure we were annoying people, but it seemed like it was a lot of fun. My brother, my oldest brother, was able to join the local 3 electrical union because of the work of organizations like LDF to open up those unions. And people say, oh my goodness, they say wonderful things about you, but I always like to reference my siblings like I just talked about my sister. It was my brother, the electrician, who, by the way, probably is the only one of us who is financially really sound because he spent years in the union. And it was he, and I don't even know if Olivia knows this, it was he who signed the promissory note for my student loan that allowed me to go to Vassar College. So it was the paying forward of the participation in the public goods. And the difference between 1968 and 2018 is the dismantling of that whole vision of the importance of public life. And something even more sinister, the deliberate effort to denigrate public life and goods by associating them with race. Public housing, which, as Richard knows, was originally built for white people. When you think about public housing, if an image came into your head, you would be thinking about black people in a black community. Public transportation, mass transit, is thought of as something that is for black people. Public education has become racialized to the point that people think of it as being associated with black people. And once it's associated with black people, it becomes denigrated. It becomes something that you don't want. The private becomes better. Private education and your private car and your own big McMansion. These are the things that we value. And we have now decided that that which is public, that which unites us, that which we all participate in, that which forms the platform of our society, now has become racialized in a way that now justifies why there is not the investment and support for it that there used to be, as Linda Darling-Hammond pointed out, and there should be. Not because it wasn't successful, but because it has been branded with race. This racial brand, now associated with public life, has made the project of denigrating and dismantling public goods a successful project. But until we are able to reinvigorate a commitment to public life, we cannot address the issue of jobs and housing and education and all of the issues that were discussed in the Kerner report and have been part of this conference. Just think about the red line cancellations that I talked about in Baltimore. Think about the job implications, the education implications, the mobility implications, the segregation implications, and so forth. Even if you give people vouchers, if they can't get to and from those places, remember, even if someone wants to leave their community, it doesn't mean that they don't want to continue to go to the church that's their family church, that's in their home neighborhood. It doesn't mean that they don't want to be every weekend at their sister's house or their cousin's house who's a key member of the family, or that they don't want to have Sunday night dinner, right, with their family members in the old neighborhood. And to the extent you don't think about all of the ways these issues affect what we're calling choice, a word that really often means there really is no choice at all, we will not be able to move through to fulfill the agenda that the Kerner Commission talked about. And so in addition to specific policy and litigation and enforcement measures that we have to undertake, we also have to reclaim the narrative about the value of public life and public goods, especially at this moment in our country. We are being destroyed by the idea that we are not interdependent. We have abandoned an understanding of citizenship being at its core about not only our rights, but our shared sense of responsibility to one another. We've abandoned the idea that public education is vitally important to the project of democracy. Let's be clear, we didn't have a problem understanding the importance of public education in this country until 1954. Until the Supreme Court said that you would have to share it equally, we had no problem understanding the centrality of public education to our democracy. And I fear that even we perhaps forget what the Supreme Court actually said about public education in Brown. Of course we remember that they said that separate cannot be equal. Of course we remember that, but we forget that the Supreme Court also called public education, and I'm quoting, the single most important function of state and local government. We forget that the court in Brown called public education the very foundation of citizenship. The citizenship formation of public education has been lost, And we have acquiesced to the idea that education is critical only to help you pass certain tests and get a job. And thus a good education is something you get for yourself or your child in a game of competition. You have no concern about whether your neighbor is receiving a good education. And let me just give a word here on the segregation question that was raised earlier. Please remember that although the Supreme Court in the Brown decision talked about the danger and the harm of segregated education on black children, the presentation to the court was about the harm of segregation on black children and white children. The same social scientists who did the doll test and who talked about the ways in which black children were receiving a message of inferiority by enforced segregation also talked about the ways in which white children were harmed by segregation by receiving a distorted view of social reality. And they talked about the moral cynicism, the conflict, the inability to evaluate oneself fairly because you are not evaluating yourself fairly, right? It's like when we talk about all the great early baseball players, but we're not including the Negro League. You're not like evaluating yourself fairly because you probably weren't the best, right? So I think sometimes when we talk about segregation, and I hear all the time this, black children learning when they sit next to white children, I mean, that was never it. It was always about getting a quality education for black children. The whole idea, the genesis of dismantling segregated education came from Charles Hamilton Houston's tour through rural Southern schools to see the conditions in which black children were learning. And I know there are many people who have wonderful stories about their segregated schools, usually not in rural places in the South, to be frank. But that was the genesis of it. And I don't think we should abandon the reality that white children are harmed by segregated education. They don't think they're harmed, but they are harmed. Anybody looking at our society today can see what that harm looks like. And I think we have to reclaim that narrative. And if we recognize that public education is developing us to serve as good and productive citizens in a pluralistic democracy, then it does matter to me whether my neighbor is also getting a good education. And it matters to me whether children in Jefferson County, Alabama, and Hinds County, Mississippi are getting a good education, even if I don't live there. What we're seeing in our country today, the rhetoric, the hate, the ignorance, the coarseness, the vulgarity, the cruelty, the greed, the fear, is the result of decades of poor citizenship development. It is a reflection of the fully privatized notion of citizenship, a feral conflict for the scraps left by oligarchs. And if we don't recognize the signs of it, it will only continue. One of the things we're looking at LDF is virtual education, right? The idea that you can put on some headphones and sit at a computer the entire day with an individualized plan. Doesn't that sound wonderful for your child to have an individualized learning plan? But when that individualized plan means that you're sitting in front of a computer, it doesn't even matter at that point whether you're in a segregated school or not, because you are a school of one. You're not even really interacting with the teachers. When you hear these things, when they tell you that they have all the AP courses, but they're all virtual, the whole point of an AP course is supposed to be that you were having dialogue, thick dialogue about complex ideas about our society. It was supposed to be about critical thinking. And now you can just put on some headphones and hope you get a 5 on the AP exam? I mean, are we paying attention to the ways in which all of these signals are designed to shrink us into the sole individual? And I can tell you that we will not win that way. We will not win that way. So the value of public life is most powerfully developed, I think, in our public space. And that means the physical construct of our communities has to reflect our values. And this means that the project of ending racial and socioeconomic segregation and inequality is really a project at this point of democratic survival for this country. So I view this 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report as a kind of emergency alarm. This may be our last chance. I don't think we have another 50 years. Our democracy will be so downgraded in the next 10 years if we don't turn this thing around. And a key aspect of this is recognizing that our society, our communities, are literally physically hardwired against democracy. Segregation and inequality is fundamentally anti-democratic. And if most of the communities in our country are segregated and reflect socioeconomic and racial inequality, then they are anti-democratic. I don't care how many elections you have in them. Our project must be premised on the understanding that ending our segregated lives is a matter of national democratic survival, because equity is a matter of national democratic survival. The unmasking of the architecture of racism in the public space and the demand that every decision and policy that affects our public spaces address and confront this reality is key to this project. And you hold the power to do this. We hold the power to do this. It requires first taking that red pill and recognizing all of the decisions that are made every day in our communities that affect this project of equity and of democracy. This conference has energized me to strengthen LDF's work in this area. I've described some of the things that we're working on. Housing discrimination is a key part of our work over the next 4 years. But when we say housing discrimination, we mean implicated by all of the things that I just described to you. Pulling that thread and ensuring that we are talking holistically about how we ensure that resources are distributed equally, how we ensure that we don't allow this new narrative about public education. It's not even a new narrative. I mean, freedom of choice is exactly the language that was used by those southern school districts that did not want to desegregate. It was mentioned earlier today, something about, I think it was mentioned about Prince Edward County, Virginia. This is the county that closed the public schools for 5 years rather than integrate. 5 years. So if you don't understand how serious they are about this project, just understand what that means to have closed public schools for 5 years rather than integrate. Those black children who were denied an education, and many were, some families could send their children to stay with relatives. The white children went to private white academies, but many of those black children never received an education, because imagine that your school closes when you're 12 years old and then reopens when you're 17 or 18. Do you want to go back to the 7th grade? No, so they just kept it moving. So understand the danger that we face. I do feel strengthened and energized for this work, in part because of this conference, and in part because the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report reminds us that it is a matter of urgency, that if we drag our feet, we can wake up and it's 50 years later. And I'm also inspired by my own life, by the story I just told you about what it takes to move the possibilities and opportunities for a family like mine, and what I was privileged to be able to take advantage of because of the commitment to public goods. And so I hope that you're encouraged to do your part in this critical effort. I hope that you will reach out to the Legal Defense Fund when you think that there are interesting cases that we can bring in your jurisdiction. We're always looking for good litigation. And I hope that you leave this conference with a renewed commitment to occupying fully the space that you are in, the space that you live in. First of all, learning the history of your community. What do you know about your community and what it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago? What do you know about the town that you live in? Learn about it. Understand that it was constructed by decisions and policies, and then recognize you have the power to construct the community of tomorrow out of the decisions that you make today. Thank you.